The millionaire's son had a problem that neither money nor the best doctors could solve. Almost every night, he sleepwalked around the house. The father, desperate and exhausted, didn't know what to do anymore, fearing for the boy's safety. That's when a new housekeeper, a quiet and observant woman, was hired to work at the mansion. No one paid much attention to her until one night, the father woke up to a strange noise. When he went out into the hallway, the scene he saw left him in shock, questioning everything he thought he knew about his son and the house they lived in. Arthur Sterling's empire had been forged in steel, strategy, and the volatility of the stock market, a financial colossus whose tentacles reached across continents. He was a man who converted capital into power, who understood the language of numbers, of interest rates and dividends, as few others did. His net worth, a vast tapestry of stocks, real estate and hedge funds, was a testament to his brilliant mind and his relentless determination. He navigated the business world with the precision of a predator, turning every opportunity into profit, every challenge into another layer of his unshakable fortune. However, within the walls of his own home, a mansion of cold marble and windows that looked more like empty eyes, all his power dissolved into a fog of helplessness. There, he was not the billionaire the world knew, but just a father terrified of the night. His terror had a name: Leo, his only son. An 8-year-old boy with honey-colored eyes and a sadness that seemed to have settled in his soul since his mother's departure. Every night, the same ritual of anguish. A silent alarm vibrated on his wrist, a pulse of panic that tore him from a shallow, restless sleep. It was the motion sensor in Leo's room. Arthur would rise, his heart hammering against his ribs, and walk the opulent hallways, which felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The works of art on the walls, the Persian rugs under his feet, all that wealth became meaningless before the small figure wandering in the darkness. Leo walked with his eyes open but vacant, an automaton lost in a dream that no one could decipher. Arthur's fear was visceral. The stairs, an open window, the pool in the garden. The mansion, once a symbol of his success, had become a high-tech prison, a labyrinth of sensors and cameras to contain the threat that came from within. The best doctors his money could buy had failed. Renowned therapists had declared themselves defeated. Each left behind a different diagnosis and the same absence of solutions. The household manager, Judith, a woman of rigid posture and a severe gaze, was the personification of the order and discipline Arthur tried to impose on the chaos. She insisted on a mild sedative, a liquid she claimed was prescribed and essential. But the sedatives only left Leo more lethargic during the day, a little ghost floating through the house, devoid of a child's vibrant energy. Hope, for Arthur, had become a luxury that not even all his assets could buy, a cryptocurrency of unattainable value in his own personal market of despair. He felt like a failure, the man who built an empire but couldn't protect his own heir from the shadows that haunted him. The change began subtly, almost imperceptibly. One of the housekeepers resigned, and a replacement was hired through the agency, a formality, a small gear replaced in the well-oiled machine of his household administration. Arthur barely paid attention when Judith informed him, too busy analyzing the cash flow of one of his companies. He didn't know, couldn't have known, that this small alteration in the routine was the first domino in a line that was about to fall, forever altering the architecture of his life. That afternoon, while watching Leo play joylessly in the garden through the security glass of his office, he saw the new employee approach. She wasn't announced with the usual formality. She simply appeared, a silent presence at the threshold of the glass door, waiting to be noticed. When their eyes met, Arthur felt an inexplicable chill, a strange sense that the air in that house, thin and heavy for so long, was about to change. Her name was Helena, and she carried in her eyes an ancient wisdom that contrasted with the cold, aseptic efficiency of everything else. Helena moved through the mansion with the discretion of a shadow, but her presence was felt like a gentle warmth amidst the cold marble. Unlike the other staff, who performed their duties with robotic efficiency, almost afraid to leave a human mark on the sterile environment, she brought with her a scent of lavender and a serenity that seemed immune to the house's oppressive atmosphere. From his office fortress, where he monitored the fluctuations of his gold and crypto investments as much as the corridors of his home, Arthur watched her on the cameras. She didn't hurry, nor did she display the subservient anxiety that Judith demanded of everyone. Her work was impeccable, but there was something more to her gestures, a delicacy, a care that transcended mere professional obligation. He, a man accustomed to analyzing the profitability of every asset, began to watch Helena like an anomalous investment, an unexpected factor in his equation of despair. The first week was a silent study in contrasts. Arthur watched Judith march through Leo's room like a general inspecting her troops. She organized the toys with military rigidity, insisting that excessive visual stimuli were detrimental to the boy's sleep. The toy cars were lined up by color, the books by size, and anything that might inspire a shred of imagination was considered contraband. "The mind requires order to rest, Mr. Sterling," she would repeat in her daily reports, with the conviction of someone stating a scientific truth. To her, the boy was not a child to be understood, but a system to be controlled, a liability on her domestic balance sheet. She forbade Leo from keeping his most precious treasures nearby, claiming his emotional disarray stemmed from the physical disarray of his environment. The object of greatest contention was an old teddy bear, with one button eye and fur worn thin by time and tears. It had been a gift from his mother, Leo's last anchor to a world that had been torn from him too soon. Judith, in her clinical wisdom, decreed that the bear was a source of anxiety and placed it high on a shelf, out of reach of the small hands that searched for it in the dark. Arthur saw the scene on camera, saw the lost look in his son's eyes as he gazed at his exiled friend, and felt a pang of impotent anger. He was a billionaire, a titan of industry, yet he felt chained by this woman's rules, afraid that any interference might worsen his son's already fragile state. It was then that Helena acted. One afternoon, while cleaning Leo's room, she paused in front of the shelf. Arthur, mesmerized by the screen, held his breath. She glanced discreetly toward the door, as if feeling the weight of the cameras, but her decision was already made. With the naturalness of someone correcting a small error in the universe, she took the teddy bear and placed it on Leo's pillow, arranging its cloth arms as if preparing it for an embrace. It wasn't an act of open defiance, but a silent rebellion, an act of compassion that broke Judith's protocol. In that instant, Arthur felt the ground of his certainties shift. In this house where every action was calculated, where discipline was law, Helena had introduced a powerful and unforeseeable variable, kindness, and he, the man who mastered the art of predicting markets, realized he had no idea how to calculate the impact of that simple gesture. That night, Arthur didn't sleep. He remained in his office, his eyes fixed on the screen displaying the grainy image of his son's room. He saw Leo stir, the small twitches that preceded his nocturnal wanderings, but something was different. The boy's hands, which used to clutch the sheets in a gesture of anguish, now held the teddy bear tightly. He hugged it with a force that broke Arthur's heart. The sleepwalking came, as always, but the terror on Leo's face seemed softened, as if the presence of his old stuffed friend was a small anchor in his sea of nightmares. He didn't go far, just sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes before lying down again, the bear still pressed against his chest. For Arthur, who measured success in terms of profit and portfolio growth, that small change was the most valuable dividend he had received in years. The peace, however, was short-lived. The next morning, Judith entered Leo's room with her martial efficiency and stopped abruptly. On the cameras, Arthur saw her posture stiffen, her shoulders tensing like a soldier who finds a breach in the defenses. The bear was back in its place of honor. The confrontation didn't happen there, in front of the child. Judith was too professional for that. She waited until she found Helena in the hallway. Arthur turned up the volume on the audio system, becoming a cowardly spectator to his own life. Judith's voice was low, but sharp as glass. "There has been a violation of the protocol established for Leonardo's well-being," she said, without preamble. The object was relocated. Helena, who was polishing a silver banister, didn't stop her circular motion but lifted her gaze. Her face was calm, a serene pond in contrast to Judith's contained storm. "He's just a child, Miss Judith. He missed his bear." The simplicity of the answer seemed to disarm the household manager for a second. "And it is not about what he feels, but what behavioral analysis dictates. The bear is a trigger for his separation anxiety," Judith retorted, her voice dripping with the authority of manuals and theories. Helena finally stopped polishing and straightened up, the cloth in her hand. "With all due respect, sometimes a child's soul doesn't need analysis, it just needs comfort." Arthur felt the words in his chest. Comfort, such a simple, human word, and so absent from his multi-million-dollar house. He managed complex businesses, made decisions that affected the lives of thousands, but he had forgotten how to offer the most basic comfort to his own son. The exchange in the hallway was brief, ending with a stern warning from Judith about insubordination and the consequences of deviating from professional guidelines. Helena merely nodded, a gesture that indicated not submission, but a deep, unshakable patience. Later, a new glimpse of hope. Arthur saw Helena in Leo's room again. The boy was sitting on the floor, quietly assembling a puzzle. Helena was dusting the furniture and began to hum a simple melody, a lullaby Arthur vaguely remembered from his own childhood. Leo looked up from the puzzle, not at her, but toward the sound. He didn't smile, but the tension in his small shoulders seemed to dissipate, like morning fog under a shy sun. He just sat there, listening. For a long time, it was a tiny seed of connection being planted in the arid soil of his son's loneliness. That night, the alarm on his wrist vibrated with familiar urgency. Arthur leaped out of bed, his heart already in his throat. He rushed to the monitors, the standard procedure in his panicked routine. Leo's bed was empty. Arthur scanned the other cameras with his eyes, searching for the small figure in the dark hallways near the dangerous staircase. But he was nowhere. A chill ran down his spine. Where could he have gone? Then, an external camera in the backyard detected movement. The image was dark, blurred by the light rain that had begun to fall, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was Leo in his pajamas, standing at the edge of the ornamental pond, staring into the dark, still water, and he wasn't alone. Beside him, holding his hand, was Helena. Arthur Sterling's heart raced like the shares of a soaring tech company, a cold panic, the likes of which none of his risky business deals had ever induced, seized his body. The image of his son at the edge of the dark pond was a nightmare made real, the exact scenario of all his nocturnal fears. He didn't think, he just ran, barefoot, wearing only pajama pants and a t-shirt. He crossed the marble corridors, the floor's cold seeping into his feet without him noticing. He pushed open the heavy glass doors leading to the garden, the damp air and fine rain hitting his face. Every step on the wet grass was torture. His mind painting terrible scenarios, each more horrifying than the last. All his assets, his vast net worth, his incalculable fortune, it all seemed like a pile of useless ash at the prospect of losing his one true treasure. But the scene he found paralyzed him, not with the horror he expected, but with its strange, inexplicable serenity. Helena wasn't fighting with Leo, wasn't forcibly holding him back from the water. She was kneeling beside him, at his level, her hand holding his with a gentle firmness. The boy, his eyes open and vacant, was pointing at the trembling reflection of the garden lights on the dark surface of the pond. Helena wasn't looking at the boy, but where he pointed, and she was speaking to him, her voice as soft as the falling rain. "Yes, sweetie. Look how the moon has hidden in the water. It's sleepy too, just like you." She wasn't trying to wake him or contradict him. She had entered his dream, walking beside him in that invisible world. Arthur stood a few feet away, hidden in the shadow of an ancient oak tree, his chest heaving. He was an intruder in this moment of oniric communion. The anguish that always twisted Leo's features during his sleepwalking was gone. In its place was a peaceful curiosity, a calm Arthur hadn't seen in his son for years, not even when he was awake. He, the man who built an empire on cold logic and calculated strategy, was witnessing something his mind couldn't process. It was a cure that didn't come from a syringe or a manual, but from a place of deep human empathy. After a minute that felt like an eternity, Helena slowly stood up. "The moon has gone to sleep now, Leo. It's time for us to go back to bed too." And, as if responding to a logical suggestion within his own dream, the boy turned and began walking back to the house, his hand still held in hers. Only then did Helena seem to notice Arthur's presence in the darkness. Their eyes met for an instant, and in her gaze there was no fear or surprise, only a silent understanding. He followed them back inside, a ghost in his own home. He watched Helena guide Leo to his room, tuck him into bed, covering him with the comforter and placing the teddy bear in his arms. She remained by the bed for a moment, her hand resting gently on the boy's forehead until his breathing became deep and regular. Then she withdrew as silently as she had arrived. Arthur was left alone in the room, the sound of the rain outside and the steady rhythm of his son's breathing filling the silence. His eyes scanned the room and landed on the nightstand. There sat the small glass vial. With the clear liquid Judith administered every night, the mild sedative, for the first time, a dark and terrible doubt began to take shape in his mind. A cold suspicion that made him question not only the housekeeper's methods, but his own blind trust in her. The next morning dawned grey and damp, a perfect reflection of Arthur's state of mind. He hadn't returned to his bed. He had spent the rest of the night in his office, the small vial of sedative on his mahogany desk, looking as harmless and yet as threatening as a sleeping snake. The scene in the garden replayed in his mind in an endless loop. Helena's calm, the peace on Leo's face. Those images clashed violently with years of clinical reports, Judith's pseudoscientific explanations, and his own passive acceptance. He, a man who built his fortune by analyzing data, questioning every line of a balance sheet, and demanding transparency in every deal, realized with nauseating clarity that he had outsourced his son's well-being without due diligence. He demanded rigorous audits for a simple stock investment, but had blindly accepted an unlabeled vial from a woman whose authority he had never dared to question. Guilt was an acid eating away at his insides. The decision was made at first light. He could no longer live in uncertainty. He picked up his phone and made a call to a contact at one of the country's most advanced pharmaceutical labs, a company in which his investment holding firm held a minority stake. He spoke in code, as he did when discussing sensitive acquisitions. He mentioned a private sample that needed a complete and urgent toxicological analysis. Secrecy, he stressed, was absolute. The response was immediate. A courier would be at his door in under an hour. With the same precision he used to wire millions of dollars between accounts, he used a sterile syringe from a first aid kit to extract a small sample of the liquid, depositing it into a sterile container. The original vial, still nearly full, went back on Leo's nightstand, a silent bait in a trap he had only just begun to set. But waiting for the results would be torture. The doubt, once planted, grew like a weed, choking out every other certainty. He needed to look Judith in the eye. He needed to confront her, not with accusations, but with questions. He summoned her to his office under the pretext of discussing the household budget. She entered with her customary impeccable posture, a leather folder in hand, the very picture of efficiency. Arthur watched her sit, her hands folded over the folder, her face a mask of impassive professionalism. "Judith," he began, his voice calmer than he felt. "I'd like to revisit Leonardo's treatment protocol." She raised an eyebrow, an almost imperceptible movement. "The protocol is performing as expected, sir. There have been some incidents, which is normal, but the frequency has been gradually decreasing, just as Dr. Miller predicted." Arthur leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "I have my doubts about the medication. I'd like to know the exact name of the compound. I want to do my own research." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with an invisible tension. Judith did not waver. "It's a mild formulation, developed specifically for him. The trade name would mean nothing to you. Trust the process, Mr. Sterling. Your anxiety as a father is understandable, but it can interfere with the treatment. Unprofessional methods," she added, with a slight emphasis, "can cause dangerous regressions." The veiled threat was clear. She was warning him, using his pain against him. Arthur stared back, his face a blank slate, but inside, the suspicion was solidifying into a certainty as cold and hard as the gold in his vaults. The conversation with Judith left Arthur with a bitter taste in his mouth. Her words, so professional and polished, rang false, evasive. The mention of unprofessional methods was a barb clearly aimed at Helena, and the refusal to name the drug under the pretext of protecting him from his own anxiety was the final insult. He, who negotiated with industry sharks and deciphered the most complex investment strategies, was being treated like an ignorant child. The anger, cold and precise, began to replace the despair. He knew a direct confrontation without concrete proof would be useless. Judith was a master of manipulation, a cunning operator who had turned his home into her personal fiefdom. To unmask her, he would need more than intuition. He would need irrefutable data. While the lab analysis was underway, Arthur decided he needed to understand the other side of the equation, Helena. He found her in the staff kitchen at the end of the day, as she was having a cup of tea before leaving. The kitchen was a simple, functional space, a world apart from the ostentatious luxury of the rest of the mansion. For the first time, he felt like a stranger in his own house. He cleared his throat at the doorway, and Helena turned, surprised. "Mr. Sterling, please call me Arthur," he said, the formality suddenly seeming ridiculous. "May I sit?" She nodded, her gaze wary but not fearful. Arthur sat on the simple wooden chair, a galaxy away from his Italian leather armchairs. "Helena," he began, unsure how to frame the question burning in his mind. "What you saw that night, in the garden, how did you know what to do?" She took a sip of her tea, giving herself a moment to think. Her answer, when it came, was not what he expected. "I don't know, sir. Arthur, I'm not a doctor, but I have children and grandchildren. I've seen a lot of nightmares. Sometimes you don't have to fight the monster. You just have to sit beside the child in the dark and tell them it isn't real." Her words were like a key, unlocking a long-bolted door in Arthur's heart. He remembered his own childhood, forgotten nightmares, and the gentle touch of his mother's hand on his forehead. A memory so distant, it felt like it belonged to another life. "Judith believes in rigidity, in protocols," he said, more to himself than to her. Helena shrugged, a gesture of folk wisdom. "Though you can prune a plant with all the rigidity in the world, but if you don't give it sun and water, it dies from the inside." In that moment, Arthur knew. It didn't matter what the lab results said. Judith could have all the degrees and recommendations in the world, but she lacked the most essential ingredient. one that Helena possessed in abundance: humanity. The conversation stretched on. He, the reclusive billionaire, and she, the quiet housekeeper, spoke of loss, of the pain that shapes a life, and of the resilience of a child's spirit. She told him how she learned to sing lullabies to calm a feverish grandchild, about the importance of listening to what isn't said. He, in turn, found himself confessing his loneliness, the immense chasm between his vast fortune and his sense of failure as a father. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed. Judith watched them from a distance, her eyes like little chips of ice. The tension in the house became palpable, a static electricity that crackled in the hallways. The household manager intensified her surveillance of Helena, criticizing insignificant details of her work, trying to isolate her, to reassert her authority. The teddy bear disappeared from Leo's bed again, this time locked in a closet in the storage room. It was an act of pure malice, a declaration of war. And it was this silent war that solidified Arthur's resolve. He was no longer just seeking a cure for his son. He was hunting a monster hiding in plain sight. The next 2 days were the longest of Arthur's life. The mansion, once just cold, now seemed to hold a malevolent presence lurking in every shadow. The tension between Judith and Helena was a cold war fought in the details. A frigid glance exchanged over Leo's head, a flower vase subtly moved out of place, an order given in an unnecessarily harsh tone. Judith moved like a queen in her castle, certain of her power, while Helena responded with a silent dignity that seemed to enrage her even more. Leo, deprived of his bear again, regressed. His nights were once again filled with long, anguished walks through the corridors, and his daytime lethargy deepened. Arthur watched it all, his heart a knot of helplessness and rage, waiting for the phone call that could either confirm his worst suspicions or plunge him back into confusion. The call came on a rainy afternoon. Arthur was in his office, his computer screen displaying stock market charts that seemed irrelevant, colorful blurs from a world that no longer mattered. His personal cell phone, the number only a select few possessed, vibrated on the desk. It was a blocked number. He answered, his hand trembling slightly. "Arthur Sterling." The voice on the other end was professional, that of a senior chemist from the lab. He was direct but cautious. "Mr. Sterling, we have the results of the analysis on the sample you sent. The composition is unexpected." Arthur felt a chill. "Unexpected how?" "Sir, the liquid you sent us is not a mild sedative. Not even close. It's a diluted but still potent solution of zolpidem." The chemical name meant nothing to Arthur. "What is that?" he asked, his voice dry. There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if the chemist was choosing his words carefully. "It's a powerful hypnotic, a black box warning drug used to treat severe insomnia in adults. Its sale is strictly controlled. In children, its use is expressly forbidden. The studies are inconclusive, but the reported side effects are severe." The floor seemed to open up beneath Arthur's chair. The world around him contracted, focusing only on the voice on the phone. "What kind of side effects?" "Complex and prolonged sleepwalking episodes," the chemist said, and each word was a hammer driving a nail into the coffin of Arthur's innocence. "The person can walk, talk, even perform complex tasks, all while fast asleep. Hallucinations, intense night terrors, amnesia about the events. In a child whose brain is still developing, the effects are unpredictable and extremely dangerous." Arthur hung up the phone. The click seemed to echo through the silent office. The full report arrived by email seconds later, a PDF document filled with graphs and technical terms that all boiled down to one simple or monstrous truth. Judith. It was her. It wasn't incompetence. It was calculated cruelty. She wasn't treating the problem. She was creating it, night after night. She was poisoning his son, turning him into a perpetual patient to justify her methods, to maintain her control, her authority, her position of power in that house, the indispensable housekeeper, the child behavior specialist. It was all a sham, a diabolical manipulation built on the suffering of a child and the despair of a father. The pain in his chest transformed into something new, something frigid and sharp. It was rage, the rage of a father who discovers an unforgivable betrayal. He looked at the monitor showing the dining room. There she was, adjusting the silverware, the picture of perfection and order, a predator dressed in professionalism. The mask had fallen, and Arthur Sterling, the man who built his empire on the ruins of his adversaries, knew exactly what to do with predators. Arthur's fury was not hot and explosive like a wildfire, but cold and silent like the advance of a glacier. Sitting in his office, the lab report open on his computer screen, he felt no urge to scream or break things. He felt a sharp clarity, a deadly precision that had served him well in the ruthless world of business. Every line of the report was like a clause in a fraudulent contract, and Judith was the defaulting party. He analyzed her not as an employee, but as a toxic asset that had contaminated his entire portfolio, a liability that needed to be liquidated immediately, without hesitation. The grief would come later. Now was the time for surgery. He waited, letting his anger settle and transform into a polished, unbreakable strategy. He would not give her the satisfaction of an emotional confrontation. He would give her the humiliation of a corporate execution. With a calmness that startled him, he pressed the intercom button. "Judith, please come to my office." His voice was neutral, the same one he used to summon a subordinate to discuss quarterly goals. Her response was immediate and confident. "On my way, sir." A few minutes later, she knocked softly on the door and entered, her posture erect, her face a mask of competence. She was holding a tablet, ready to present her daily report on Leo's progress. "Mr. Sterling, I wanted to discuss the nightly dosage. I believe that—" "Sit down, Judith," he interrupted, his tone still perfectly level. He gestured to the chair in front of his desk. Surprised by the break in protocol, she hesitated for a moment before complying. Arthur said nothing. He simply swiveled his computer monitor to face her. On the screen, in large, unmistakable letters, was the name Zolpidem and a description of its devastating effects on children. The silence in the office was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the computer. Arthur watched her mask shatter. It was a slow process, seconds that dragged on for an eternity. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a waxy pallor. Her lips, usually pursed in a line of authority, trembled slightly. Her eyes, normally cold and calculating, widened in a mixture of panic and hatred. The professionalism dissolved like wet paper, revealing the cruel, manipulative woman underneath. "I don't know what that is," she whispered, her voice a thread. "There must be some mistake." "There is no mistake," Arthur said, his voice low. But each word weighed a ton. "There are only facts." He didn't need to shout. The report on the screen screamed for him. "You don't understand," she hissed, her defensiveness turning to venom. "He was uncontrollable, a weak, troubled boy. I brought order to this house. I was helping him." "Pack your things," Arthur said, his tone final, like a judge delivering a sentence. "You have 10 minutes. 2 of my security guards will escort you to the gate. Any attempt to contact anyone in this house will result in legal action that will consume every penny you own and every minute of the rest of your life." He stood up, the gesture ending the conversation. Judith's empire, built on lies and a child's suffering, had crumbled in less than 5 minutes. She was escorted off the property, a diminished, pathetic figure, leaving behind a silence that was, for the first time in a long time, truly peaceful. That night, for the first time in years, Leo slept soundly, without a single twitch, without the shadow of a nighttime walk. The cure, however, brought no relief to Arthur. As he watched his son sleep, his breathing soft and easy, he was hit by an overwhelming wave of guilt. The external threat had been removed, but how could he remove the internal wound, the memory of his own terrible negligence? Judith's dismissal left a vacuum in the house, a silence that was both peaceful and deafening. For Arthur, the housekeeper's absence did not bring the relief he had imagined. On the contrary, it removed the shield that had protected him from the most painful truth, his own failure. He spent the night in an armchair in the corner of Leo's room, watching the boy's chest rise and fall in a calm, natural rhythm, a spectacle more valuable than any performance chart from his financial portfolio. Every breath his son took was a silent accusation. He, the billionaire who understood the complex mechanisms of global markets, who could predict the fluctuation of currencies like the dollar and the euro, who had turned a small initial capital into a colossal fortune, had been blind to the poison being administered in his own home. His assets, his holdings, his entire net worth seemed like a bad joke in the face of this small, fragile life he had almost allowed to be destroyed. When the morning light filtered through the window, Leo awoke. It was not the groggy, confused awakening of before, but a slow, clear emergence from a deep sleep. His honey-colored eyes blinked, focusing on his father's tired face, and as for the first time in a long time, there was a light in them, a presence not clouded by chemistry. "Dad," he said, his voice a little hoarse, the word hanging in the air like a question. Arthur felt a lump in his throat. He moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I'm here, son." But the words sounded hollow to his own ears. What could he say? How could he begin to repair the years of distance? The pain he hadn't seen. The door opened softly, and Helena entered, carrying a tray with a glass of juice and a slice of cake. She made no fuss, didn't comment on Judith's absence. She just smiled at Leo, a genuine smile that lit up the room. "Good morning, sleepyhead. I thought a champion deserved a special breakfast." Leo smiled back, a real smile, not the shadow of one Arthur was used to seeing. It was like the first dividend from an investment long thought lost. He watched, a spectator in his own family, as Helena talked to Leo about simple things, the sun outside, the taste of the cake, the birds in the garden. She didn't treat him like a patient or a problem, but like a boy. The interaction between them was as natural as breathing, a positive emotional cash flow that Arthur didn't know how to generate. He felt like an outsider, an intruder. His presence seemed to disrupt the delicate balance Helena had created. He was the man with the money, the owner of the house, but in that room, the real treasure was the connection he did not possess. After finishing his cake, Leo snuggled into the pillows, looking more relaxed than Arthur had ever seen him. Helena collected the tray, and as she passed Arthur at the door, she paused. She didn't look at him with pity, but with a firm understanding. "He's going to need you now," she said in a low voice. But the words hit him with the force of a command. Not the billionaire, the father. Then she turned to the boy and said, her voice clear and audible for Arthur to hear, "Leo, your dad told me you two have a secret project, something about building the best boat of all time." The boy looked at Arthur, his eyes shining with a fragile, terrifying hope, and Arthur found himself trapped, with nowhere to run from the question hanging in the air. Leo's eyes, filled with a newfound hope, were a courtroom from which Arthur could not escape. He, a man who had faced hostile boards of directors and merger negotiations that dragged on for nights on end, felt completely disarmed by his son's silent question. Helena's secret project was a brilliant, cruel trap. For a moment, the old Arthur, the business titan, tried to take control. His mind immediately calculated the variables, seeking the most efficient solution, the one requiring the greatest investment of capital, but the least of himself. "A boat!" he exclaimed, forcing an enthusiasm that rang hollow in his own ears. Of course, a great idea. We can buy the best model kit money can buy, import one from Germany, perhaps, or hire an expert to help us build a perfect replica of a classic sailboat. He was offering what he had always offered, resources, the power of his vast fortune to solve a problem. But Leo shook his head, a small but firm gesture. His bare feet touched the cold floor, and he ran to his desk, pulling open a rarely used drawer. From inside, he took out a yellowed, crumpled piece of paper and held it out to Arthur. It was a child's drawing, the lines crooked but unmistakable. A simple sailboat with a large sail and a smiling sun in the corner. "Mom drew this," Leo said, his voice low. "She said one day we'd make one, with real wood, to put in the pond." The drawing wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a testament, an emotional inheritance worth more than all the stocks and bonds in his portfolio. And the request wasn't about having a boat, but about fulfilling a promise. It was about connecting the past to the present. Arthur felt the weight of that sheet of paper in his hands, as if it were a bar of gold. "With real wood," Arthur repeated, his voice barely a whisper. The journey began there. He had no idea how to build a boat. His experience with manual labor was nil. He built empires, not toys. Guided by Leo, he went down to the back garage, an area of the mansion he hadn't visited in years. It was a mausoleum of abandoned projects and forgotten assets. Bicycles Leo never used, expensive gardening equipment still in its boxes, a classic sports car covered by a dusty tarp. It was a graveyard of good intentions bought with money. In one corner was an old workbench that had belonged to Leo's grandfather, covered in tools Arthur could barely name. The air smelled of dust, oil, and neglect. What followed was a comedy of errors. Arthur, the man whose decisions moved millions of dollars, proved to be a complete disaster with a saw and a piece of wood. His lines came out crooked, the wood splintered, and he nearly hit his own thumb with a hammer. Frustration grew inside him. It was humiliating. He could analyze the most complex cash flow, but he couldn't perform the simplest task. He felt like an imposter, an inept father hiding behind a mountain of wealth. But then something extraordinary happened. Leo, who had always been a passive observer of life, began to participate. He didn't laugh at his father's clumsiness. With surprising seriousness, he would grab a rag and wipe away the sawdust, point to the correct line on the drawing, and even with his small hands, help hold the sandpaper. He was fully present, fully engaged. They spent hours in that dusty garage, in a silence filled only by the clumsy sound of tools. By the end of the afternoon, what they had looked nothing like a boat. It was a collection of badly cut pieces of wood held together by glue and hope. Arthur looked at the mess, a feeling of failure settling in his chest. He had given up an entire day of work, of important decisions about his funds and businesses, to produce this. He was about to suggest they stop, maybe for good, when Leo reached out and touched his hand. The boy's skin was soft against his, which was rough and dirty. Leo looked at the wood, then at his father, and a small smile appeared on his lips. "We can paint it tomorrow, Dad." The word "Dad," spoken so naturally, and the promise of tomorrow, hit Arthur with the force of a revelation. He looked at the failed project on the table and for the first time saw the true profit on his investment. The word "tomorrow" became Arthur's new anchor. For the first time in years, he woke not to the anxious buzz of a silent alarm, but to a purpose that wasn't tied to stock prices or the profitability of his hedge funds. The day in the garage became a sacred ritual. They were no longer a billionaire executive and his troubled son. They were just a father and a son, covered in sawdust and glue, trying to turn a pile of wood into a dream. The boat's construction progressed with comical slowness. Each piece was a lesson in patience for Arthur and a lesson in discovery for Leo. The boy, who once moved through the house like a ghost, was now vibrant, full of opinions about the angle of the sail and the shape of the rudder. He asked questions, made suggestions, and his laughter, whenever Arthur made another of his carpentry blunders, was the richest melody that had ever echoed in that mansion. Helena became the silent guardian of this process. She would appear at just the right moments, never intrusive, bringing a tray of cold lemonade or sandwiches cut into triangles. She offered no advice on the construction, but her eyes, as she watched them, offered a kind of approval and encouragement that was worth more than any instruction manual. Arthur found himself watching her, admiring the way she seemed to understand what they needed before they even knew it themselves. She was mending his family, not with grand gestures, but with small acts of care, like someone patching a precious fabric, thread by thread. The distance between them, the invisible barrier between employer and employee, was dissolving, replaced by a silent complicity and a mutual respect that grew with each passing day. One day, as they were sanding the hull of the little sailboat, Arthur's phone, which he now left on the workbench, began to vibrate insistently. The name on the screen was his chief operating officer in Europe, a call that would normally mean a multi-million-dollar decision on an urgent deal. The old Arthur would have answered on the first ring, but the new Arthur looked at the vibrating device, then at his son's hands, small and focused, guiding the sandpaper in a circular motion. He saw the sawdust in Leo's hair, the glint of focus in his eyes. With a calm gesture, he reached out and silenced the phone, declining the call. In that instant, he consciously redefined the concept of wealth. His true inheritance was not in vaults or bank accounts, but right there, in that dusty garage, in the sound of sandpaper on wood. Finally, the day came to paint. The boat, though crooked and imperfect, was to them the most magnificent masterpiece in the world. Leo chose the colors, a deep blue for the hull and a bright white for the sail. They painted together, once again covering themselves in paint, laughing at the mess. When they finished, they stepped back to admire their creation. The afternoon sun streamed through the garage door, illuminating the little sailboat. Arthur felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of joy and sorrow. "Your mother," he said, his voice thick, breaking a silence that had lasted for years, "would have loved the colors you chose." Leo looked at the boat, then at his father's face. The security he had found in recent days gave him a courage he'd never had. He stepped closer and, with the innocent simplicity of a child who finally feels safe enough to ask what hurts the most, he looked into Arthur's eyes. "Dad," he asked, his voice clear and unwavering, "why couldn't Mom stay? Didn't she like us anymore?" The question, so direct and so feared, hit Arthur with the force of a wave. His entire empire, all his fortune and power, were useless. He had no prepared answer, no strategy, nowhere to hide from that pure, devastating pain. Leo's question hung in the dusty garage air, heavier than any gold bar in Arthur's vaults. His world, which had just found a new center of gravity, threatened to shatter. Instinct, forged in years of ruthless negotiations and crisis management, screamed at him to lie, to craft a simple story, a platitude that would shield the child from the harsh truth. It would be easy. He could blame an illness, an unavoidable trip, anything that placed the responsibility on an abstract fate. But then his gaze fell on the small wooden boat, crooked, imperfect, and infinitely precious. That boat was a monument to truth, built with clumsy hands but an honest heart. To lie now would be to betray everything they had built in these last few days. It would mean reverting to the man who built walls of money to hide from real feelings. He took a deep breath, the scent of paint and wood filling his lungs, and knelt, bringing himself to his son's level. "No, Leo," he said, his voice low and hoarse, fighting to keep it steady. "She loved you more than anything in the world, more than anything." He paused, searching for the simplest words to explain the most complex failure of his life. You know how Daddy works so much? With the business, the numbers, the money? Leo nodded, his large eyes fixed on his father's face. I thought that building our net worth, having a great fortune, was the most important thing. I thought that was how I was taking care of you. But I was wrong. I spent so much time in the office, with my investments, that this house, it got cold. I wasn't really here. And your mom, she was very lonely. She needed more sunshine, more laughter, and all I knew how to give her were things. I didn't know how to give her my time. The tears he had held back for years began to burn in his eyes. She got very, very sad, son. And when a person is sad for a very long time, sometimes they need to go to a different place to try and find happiness again. Her leaving had nothing to do with you. It had to do with me, with my mistake. The confession was out, raw and painful, in the middle of the garage. The secret he had guarded like a toxic asset, finally exposed. Leo listened to every word, his small face a canvas of conflicting emotions. The tremble in his chin subsided, and a single tear traced a path down his cheek. So, it wasn't my fault, he whispered, the question that had haunted him in every nighttime walk. No, Arthur said, the word exploding from his chest with the force of a revelation. He pulled the boy into his arms, hugging him with a strength that mixed regret with an overwhelming love. It was never your fault, Leo, never. It was mine. The fault was all mine. And there, amidst paint cans and old tools, they wept together, a father and a son, finally mourning the same loss, not as two islands of pain, but as a continent joined by truth. The embrace lasted a long time, dissolving years of silence and loneliness. Later that night, after tucking Leo into bed, Arthur felt like a different man. The weight on his shoulders hadn't vanished, but it had transformed. Guilt was no longer an anchor but a compass, pointing toward what truly mattered. He knew with absolute certainty that this moment of healing was only possible because of one person. An urgent need to see her, to thank her, overcame him. He searched the house for her and found her in the garden, in the same spot where he had seen her on that rainy night. She was facing away from him, looking up at the stars. He paused at the threshold, watching her in silence, and then a truth hit him with the force of lightning, as shocking and undeniable as the lab report. The feeling that had been growing in his chest for this woman wasn't just gratitude. It was something infinitely deeper, more dangerous, and more hopeful. The night air was cool and fragrant with the scent of jasmine. Arthur watched Helena's silhouette against the starry sky, a calm, strong presence that had, without his realizing it, become the new north on his emotional map. Fear and hesitation, his old companions, tried to pull him back into the safety of the shadows, into the comfort of hierarchical distance. He was Arthur Sterling, the billionaire. She was Helena, his employee. The social chasm between them was vast, built on layers of wealth, power, and convention. But what were those barriers compared to the truth he had discovered in the garage, in his son's arms? They were just paper. Flimsy and meaningless. He took a step outside, the sound of his shoes on the stone causing her to turn. "Arthur," she said, the surprise in her voice tinged with a calm that was uniquely hers. "I couldn't sleep," he said, a drastic oversimplification of the revolution happening inside him. He walked closer, stopping at a respectful distance, but near enough to see the starlight reflected in her eyes. "Helena, what you did for us, I have no words. I didn't do anything a person shouldn't do for another," she replied simply. "Leo is a good boy. He just needed someone to listen to his silence." "You did more than listen," Arthur said. "You gave us a language. You taught me how to speak to my own son." He paused, his heart hammering against his ribs. "And to myself." The silence that settled between them was not uncomfortable. It was a space of understanding, where unsaid words carried as much weight as spoken ones. Today, Leo asked me about his mother, Arthur confessed, and for the first time, I told him the truth, my fault. Helena looked at him, and in her eyes, there was no judgment, only a deep empathy. The truth is sometimes a bitter medicine, but it heals. Yes, he agreed, it heals. They stood in silence again, looking at the sky. Arthur, the man who commanded an empire of business and finance, felt like a novice in an unknown and volatile territory, the human heart. I've spent my life building things, he said, his voice low, almost a thought spoken aloud. A net worth, a fortune, a legacy of assets. And today I realized my house was empty. It was a hollow structure. You filled it, Helena, with your kindness, your wisdom. You brought life back to this mausoleum. He turned to face her fully. The billionaire's mask was gone. Here, in the moonlit garden, he was just a man, vulnerable and grateful. I know this is unexpected and perhaps inappropriate, but the cash flow of my life is unbalanced. I have a surplus of gratitude and an unpayable debt to you, and I don't want you to leave. Ever. The words were out. Irrevocable. It wasn't a job offer. It wasn't a convenient arrangement. It was a plea, an appeal. He was making the biggest investment of his life, not in stocks or cryptocurrency, but in a chance at happiness. Helena listened, her face as serene as ever, but he could see a new light in her eyes, a glimmer of restrained emotion. She took a small step toward him, closing the distance between them. She didn't say yes. She didn't need to. She simply reached out her hand and rested it gently on his arm. The touch was light, but to Arthur, it felt more solid and real than all the gold in his vaults. In the silence of that garden, under the gaze of 1,000 stars, a new contract was sealed, not with ink, but with the silent promise of a shared future. The resolution was not a loud climax, but a moment of profound peace, the end of a long war waged within himself. He was finally home. The next morning brought not an abrupt transformation, but the beginning of a new, gentle normality. The house, once a space of silence and cold hallways, began to breathe. The sound that filled it was no longer the hum of security systems or the echo of hurried footsteps on marble floors, but the simple melody of daily life. Leo's laughter echoed from the garden, where he and Arthur finally launched the crooked little sailboat on the ornamental pond. The boat didn't sail with the grace of a yacht, listing comically to one side, but to the boy and his father, it was the most magnificent vessel in the world, a symbol of their shared journey. Arthur, barefoot on the grass, felt the damp earth beneath his feet, a sensation so real and fundamental it made the abstract world of his net worth and financial portfolio seem like a distant dream. Helena did not, overnight, become the lady of the mansion. Her presence was marked not by authority, but by the same grace and wisdom that had always defined her. She continued to care for the house, but now she also cared for its inhabitants in a new, deeper way. She taught them to fill the spaces with more than just expensive objects. She taught them how to grow a small herb garden in the kitchen, how to bake cookies on a rainy afternoon, how to tell stories before bed. These were small investments of time and affection that yielded incalculable dividends of joy. The chasm between the billionaire and the housekeeper was not filled with money or status. It simply vanished, rendered irrelevant by the universal language of care and family. One afternoon, a few weeks later, Arthur was in his office, but the door was open, something that had never happened before. He wasn't analyzing the stock market or the price of gold. He was on a video call with his managers, delegating responsibilities, restructuring his schedule, freeing up his time. He was good for the first time, treating his personal life not as a liability to be managed, but as his most valuable asset of all. As he ended the call, he looked toward the door. Leo stood there, holding Helena's hand. "Dad," the boy said, his voice full of excitement. "Helena said she's going to teach us how to make bread. For real, with flour and everything." Arthur smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He stood up, walked around the immense mahogany desk that had once been his fortress and his hideout, and knelt in front of them. He took Helena's other hand, his fingers lacing with hers. He looked at the face of the woman who had saved his life in a way he never knew it needed saving, and then at the face of his son, now bright and free of shadows.